Congratulations for the paper and for the slides. That were real fantastic. I don't know, your question is the special interest for the Pope Francis. That is interesting, the peripheries of the city and the slums. And what is your solution of the problem of slums? More or less I understand, but more clearly. We have a discussion in Buenos Aires that it's convenient to take the people and put in another part of the cities with organized part with apartments, or to configure the same slum and more or less to introduce the slum in the rest of the city with some...
Right. I've been to Buenos Aires. We've done some work down there in the slums, and so I know it well. I think the answer is two parts to it. If where people are locating as they initially come in is not in high vulnerable locations, it's absolutely appropriate to keep developing that. If they are in very vulnerable locations, which many are, that needs to be an organized relocation. I'll give you an example in the Mexico that I showed you. People purposefully came and put their first house in the middle of the river. Because of course in there, it's a dry riverbed, except for probably 2 weeks a year, where it's just flooded. And then they get their house flooded, and the government comes and says, you can't live here, and they give them a piece of land adjacent to the river. So often, the placement that you come into is very vulnerable. Other areas that we've worked in Johannesburg, in South Africa, people want to be near jobs. It's a fundamental thing. They want to be near services. The idea that we're going to be building on the outskirts, there's too many examples of trying to take people who are close to their work, because they have limited access and resource. They need to be walking distance to their job. So they want to be in the core of the area. So we're finding more and more people are sort of invading buildings, and they're taking over buildings, and they're coming in the space of the city. And that's all good in my opinion. You need to organize that, you need to grow that, because essentially there's no value in putting poor people on the outskirts of a city and have your jobs and the resources, education, health services, etc., in the core of the city. So it's a two-part answer depending on the vulnerability of where they are. But in premise, you want to put people closest to where they can get the necessary services.
Thank you. I particularly liked your last slide, because that reminded to me a famous distinction due to Cicero 2,000 years ago, when he says, civitas is the city of the souls, urbs is the city of the stones. And of course, nowadays, for instance, in Italy, we have only one word, which is città, or city. But in those days, they had distinguished between civitas and urbs. So what you wrote, thank you. Anybody else? Yes, please. Anne.
Just a quick one. I really enjoyed that, and I'm intrigued by your comments that we have to learn how to think about informal cities becoming more formalized. That's a longer conversation. I wanted to connect your talk to the beginning of Gretchen's and Steve's talk, and then some work we did in Arizona over a decade ago. So our work showed that biodiversity was actually higher in richer neighborhoods of the city, even correcting for distance from the urban edge, population density, and a variety of other things. So to connect urban spaces, open spaces, and your work to Gretchen's psychological experiment, I'm not sure which aspects of nature on that walk mattered, and biodiversity might not matter. Maybe we just need a tree or a patch of grass. But I wanted to hear your observations about how you think about those open spaces and what they can positively contribute to people when you have this emergent property that may or may not lead to open spaces near people.
It's an incredibly important question. and it's really actually quite difficult. So if you look at the proportion in studies that they've done between informal urbanism and formal urbanism, about 10% of the area devoted to informal urbanism is open space. Typically in more formal, you will have anywhere up to 45%, which by that stage, you'll be able to have fully fledged roads, you'll have parks, you'll have all the other. So there's this very interesting work, what you do in between as you continue to build the city. We do a exercise with communities, it's called reblocking. And you go into the communities, because often it's rather haphazard, and you work with the community to define, yes, they need open space, and you will rework out the structure of the city with the community doing this. Very, very successful in many, many of the communities, not only to provide open space, to provide space for instance, churches, for civic activities. So this idea that essentially when people come in and settle, that's round one. We will come back in understanding that cities get designed, redesigned, and rebuilt. We will build those places up a couple of times over the next 80 years, and with that will come different values at each time. So I wanted to indicate that, you know, you got your house first, and then you got the road done, so you could actually get there. That shows a 10% real estate value in your home. By the time you have stores and shops along the way, if you notice in the last one, they're starting to plant trees. That becomes the next increase. So each of these layers will readjust that initial pattern. And we only have to be looking at Rome to understand the evolutionary nature of city making. And cities can, in fact, become more biodiverse as we move through.
Thank you. Please, Steve.
I really loved your New Orleans example, the Louisiana example, and I'm just wondering, kind of knowing the dysfunction in general of governance in the U.S. and in particularly Louisiana, like have your ideas been taken up, or how likely is it that you will actually influence future development there?
To be able to do that, we're really taking on the federal government and its disjuncture with the state government, and then effectively, I would argue the only thing that's holding that back is corporate interests at the moment. It's really got nothing to do with the federal government or the state government. It's really got to do with the power players down there, which is the oil industry, that's holding back the absolute reconstruction of this.
I was just checking the list of the 100 resilient cities, the Rockefeller Foundation. Yes. I saw Lagos, New Orleans, Cape Town, they're all on there. And of course we can applaud that as an initiative, but I'm kind of more excited by what you present, John, which is that there's going to be extraordinary organic growth of cities. I mean, I'm kind of a sign up to the idea of resilience, but it feels to me like that's not conceptually necessarily the best concept, or certainly not the totality of concepts we need to be thinking about when we're thinking about such extraordinary growth and organic growth of cities. So I'm kind of fascinated to hear your reflections on that, because to me, whilst it's to be applauded, I don't think it's enough of a toolkit, because you're really talking about how can we make things that are going to grow organically and hugely flourish. It's not just about resilience to external forces, right?
Yeah, I've had a lot of interaction with the Rockefeller Foundation and their resiliency. In fact, they were one of the funders of our work for New Orleans. They have their system, and it's a check and balance system that you have. What I'm going to put forward is really the systems thinking that we're going to have. There is no government in the world that's going to be able to build the necessary city to match this 9 billion people. People will be building it themselves. So what is our way that we're going to work with them? And they're going to be unintended consequences. We are going to learn as we go, but we have to start to separate poverty away from this notion of self-build. If we look at the history of city making, in many if we look at it over the ages, there's been this very short period of time where specialists have come in and sort of built a city from scratch, like Brasilia as an example. Most functioning cities today have come through this more organic, self-organizing system that gets layered over time. And I think it's a far richer model and not a series of check boxes of resiliency.
Just tiny follow-up, which I find myself scratching my head here thinking, given the radical pace of information technologies, we don't know, we can't predict all of that, but how can we kind of empower citizens of these growing cities to draw on what's going to be an ever-growing source of information to just help them, equip them in making these decisions as they self-organize and self-create these cities?
Absolutely, it's a fascinating inquiry. So, I've been looking at a lot of the presentations. For instance, the LiDAR presentation of looking at, as you applied it to biodiversity, and we're applying it to cities. So these slums of 14 million people, you can do LiDAR and you can actually map each one, and we can adjust it. So yes, there is enormous amount of similar methods you're using throughout all of your work that can be applied into this field. And I think that's where the richness is going to come. And that's sort of ultimately my appeal, is that let's not keep seeing nature over there and city over there and not really using the same methodology. Bring the science to the city and let's begin to work in those methods. The urban systems method that all of you are talking about is really fundamental to our ability to deal with this planetary urbanism. Thank you.
So now we are ready to listen to Brian Hipp from Smart Cities to Smart Villages. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you very much.